The sound of the consulting room door closing was muffled by the silence that enveloped the space. The doctor's voice still echoed in his mind, but it felt distant, as if it were being smothered by the fog that had suddenly clouded his thoughts. He stared at the sheet of paper in front of him, his trembling hand clutching the diagnosis, though the printed words were no longer news. Terminal stage. It was as if those two words had sealed his fate once and for all. The room was cold, sterile. On the desk before him, stacks of papers, neatly arranged folders, and the clock in the corner of the wall seemed to be the only living things in that space aside from him. He took a deep breath, trying to hold onto the composure slipping away with each passing second. Soon he would have to go home, to her. How do you tell someone you love that the routine, monotonous life you've shared is about to end? The way back was a blur. The sound of cars, of people chatting on the sidewalks, all felt like a distant hum. Every step he took was a cruel reminder of what was coming, as if the ground beneath him moved slower with each passing moment. He knew he didn't have much time, and more than that, he knew he hadn't done enough with the time he had. When he arrived home, the door creaked as it always did, and the familiar smell of freshly brewed coffee greeted him. His wife was in the kitchen, focused on some trivial task. She glanced up at the sound of the door, offering him a brief but tired smile. The years had not been kind to them. What was once a relationship full of life and passion had dwindled into long silences and a routine that barely allowed them to look each other in the eye. "How was the doctor?" she asked, without lifting her gaze from what she was doing. He stopped in the middle of the room, watching her for a moment. He could tell her the truth now, right then. He could tell her that the days they had left together were numbered, that he was dying. But the words caught in his throat. There was something painfully detached in the way she asked, as if she didn't even expect an answer. The distance between them was almost tangible, and he wondered when it had all fallen apart, when the love they once had dissolved into mere coexistence. "It was fine, nothing new," he lied, feeling a tightness in his chest. She nodded, not pressing further. He walked to the sofa and sat down, watching her in silence. The last few years had been like this. Monotonous days, routines followed mechanically, as if they were merely waiting for time to pass. He wondered if she still loved him, if she had felt, even recently, the same passion they had shared in the beginning. That night, as he lay in bed beside her, unable to summon the courage to reach out and touch her, he stared at the ceiling, his mind fixated on the inevitability of death. But as he thought about the fragility of his situation, something began to shift inside him. It wasn't anger or fear. It was regret, not for the fact that he was dying, but for what he would leave behind. An incomplete life, full of unfulfilled promises. He wasn't ready to go without leaving something of value, something that made sense. Above all, he wasn't ready to leave without trying to fix what had been broken between them. The next morning, while she was still asleep, he went to the cabinet where they kept old memory boxes. At the bottom, dusty and almost forgotten, was a small wooden box. He opened it carefully, his trembling fingers sifting through letters, photographs, and keepsakes from better times. That's when he found the letter, yellowed with age, written in her soft, delicate handwriting. A love letter she had never delivered. He sat there on the cold floor and read it. Each word pierced his heart like an arrow. She had written about her dreams, the life she envisioned with him, the unconditional love she swore would never die. But somehow that love had been lost. He wondered why he had never received that letter. Would it have made a difference? Would their love have endured life's trials? Holding the letter, he knew what he had to do. With the time he had left, he would try to reignite what they once had. There would be no more lies, no more distance. He would use the remaining time to recreate the moments that had defined their love, to remind her and himself of who they were and what they meant to each other. It was his last wish. The muffled sound of the shower echoed down the hallway as he remained seated on the floor, the box open beside him. The letter rested in his hands, but his mind was far away, wandering through the memories the old piece of paper had brought back. Each sentence his wife had written reflected a version of her that now seemed almost unreal, a distant memory of the woman she had been, so different from the reserved and cold person who now shared his home. It was as if the woman who had penned those words of love and devotion had vanished, taken away by the years, the routine, and the silence. He read the letter again, this time more slowly. The softness of the words, the affection woven into every line. His wife had poured her heart into it, speaking of dreams they had yet to build, of moments she longed to share with him. It was a promise of love, a hope for a bright future. And yet, somehow, all of it had been lost, buried under the weight of daily pressures and the passage of time. Why didn't she ever give this to me? He wondered, his mind racing to unravel the mystery. Was it because time had simply passed and she'd forgotten? Or had there been a moment when she realized that the promise of a happy future with him no longer made sense to her? The sound of the shower stopped. He heard her footsteps in the bedroom as the morning routine carried on as if nothing had changed. But for him, everything was different now. That letter had shaken him in a way he hadn't expected. Did the love his wife had felt, or at least once felt, still exist somewhere? Was there still a chance to rekindle it? He carefully placed the letter back into the box, closing it with tender precision. That small discovery had sparked something inside him, something he'd thought was long dead. Despite his body slowly deteriorating, for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. He decided that before he died, he would try to rekindle the love between them, to recreate moments from their past that might remind his wife of who they once were, and perhaps who they could still be. But he knew it wouldn't be easy. Years of distance had grown between them, years of a cold, impersonal routine that had turned them into little more than housemates, no longer lovers. He would have to be patient to carefully plan how to reconnect with her. These recreations of the past would need to be subtle yet poignant. He needed to awaken her emotionally without seeming desperate or dramatic. He couldn't let her sense the urgency of his actions, knowing that if she discovered the gravity of his condition, any gesture might be dismissed as a mere attempt to make amends before his death. At breakfast, they barely spoke as usual. He watched her silently, studying her movements, her features, searching for any hint of an opening, a trace of affection. It was hard to tell what was going through her mind. She seemed so focused on practicalities, so absorbed in the day-to-day, that he wondered if she even thought about when things had changed between them. "Do you have plans for the weekend?" he asked, breaking the silence. She looked at him, surprised by the question, as though it was unusual for him to start a conversation that wasn't about something trivial. "No, I don't think so." "Why?" "I thought maybe we could do something different," he said, trying to keep his tone casual. "Maybe go somewhere we used to go." She frowned slightly, clearly unsure of where he was going with this. "What do you mean? We haven't done that in years." "Exactly. I think it might be nice to revisit some old times." She smiled, but it was brief and a little forced, as if the idea didn't quite resonate with her. Still, she didn't dismiss the suggestion outright. "Maybe," she said non-committally, turning her attention back to her coffee. He knew this would be a challenge. She had withdrawn into a shell of indifference, perhaps as a way to shield herself from the frustrations life had brought. But he was determined. Every small step would matter. After breakfast, she left for work, leaving him alone in the house with the letter still echoing in his mind. He needed a better plan. Simply suggesting activities wouldn't be enough. If he wanted her to feel connected to him again, he would have to be creative, to touch on the memories she held but might have forgotten were important. He began organizing his thoughts, mentally listing the significant moments of their marriage, the places they'd been, the gestures that had made them smile. And so, he began what he knew would be his final journey, to revive the love that had once united them. He was ready to fight against time. After all, it was his last wish. The days following his discovery of the letter felt like a thick fog. He could feel time slipping away, but he also knew he needed to act with caution. He couldn't simply tell his wife about his terminal diagnosis, nor could he overwhelm her with grand gestures that might come across as forced or insincere. If he wanted to reignite the love they'd lost, it would have to be done subtly, almost imperceptibly. He needed to touch her heart as he had in the past, before time and routine had driven them apart. That morning, while she was at work, he began putting his plan into action. He pulled out an old notebook, the kind he used to jot down ideas in when he was younger, and made his first entry in years. At the top of the page, he wrote, "Recreate the past." It was a simple title but captured exactly what he intended to do. He spent the morning organizing his memories, recalling the happiest moments they had shared. There were so many. He remembered their first dinner at the lakeside restaurant, where they promised each other they would never let the romance fade, no matter how hard life became. He remembered the spontaneous trips they took, where the destination mattered less than the company. And, of course, he remembered the small gestures, flowers left on the table for no reason, love notes tucked into her belongings. Each of these moments now felt so distant, as though they belonged to another life. He knew exactly where to start: the lakeside restaurant. It was the place where they'd had their first official dinner as a couple, where they'd laughed, talked, and, for the first time, shared their dreams for the future. He called the restaurant and made a reservation, choosing the same table they had sat at all those years ago. There was something symbolic about beginning there. It had been the start of everything, and maybe it could be the beginning of their reconnection. That weekend, when his wife returned home from work, he approached the subject delicately. "Do you remember that lakeside restaurant?" he asked casually, as if it were just a random memory that had popped into his mind. She took a moment to respond, clearly surprised by the mention. "Yes, I remember. Why?" "I made a reservation for tomorrow night," he said, keeping his tone light. "I thought we could have dinner there, like we used to." She frowned slightly, as if processing his suggestion. "It's been so long since we went there," she commented, her tone thoughtful. "I didn't think you still liked that place." "That's true. It has been a while. But I thought it might be nice to revisit some things just for fun." She hesitated. It was clear that the idea felt odd to her. But at the same time, there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes, as though she were trying to figure out the reason behind his proposal. "All right," she said at last. "We can go." The next morning, he felt nervous, a mixture of excitement and fear. He knew that night could mark a turning point. As he got ready for dinner, his thoughts raced with worry. What if she didn't feel anything? What if she had become so emotionally detached that nothing he did could reach her? The drive to the restaurant was quiet. He tried starting a few conversations, but her responses were brief, almost automatic. It felt as though she was lost in her own thoughts, which only heightened his anxiety. When they arrived at the restaurant, the hostess led them to the reserved table, and he was struck by how familiar it all felt. It was exactly as he remembered. A table by the window overlooking the lake, which shimmered softly under the glow of the surrounding lights. They sat down, and for a few minutes, silence lingered as they studied the menus. He was just about to ask if she remembered their first time there when she broke the silence. "This brings back a lot of memories," she said with a faint smile, though her expression seemed distant. "The last time we were here, we were making plans for the future." Her voice trailed off as she turned to gaze out at the still, calm lake. He seized the opportunity. "And those plans, do you think they're still worth it?" he asked, striving to sound casual even as his heart raced. She looked at him, clearly surprised by the question. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean that maybe we've let go of some things that were important to us. Maybe we've lost focus, you know?" He knew he was treading risky ground by addressing this so directly, but he had to test the waters to see if there was anything left to salvage. She sighed, and for a moment, he thought she was going to shut the conversation down. But then, to his surprise, she spoke. "I think over time you just get used to how things are," she said, pausing as if choosing her words carefully. Maybe we've grown too comfortable. It was a small admission, but it was enough for him to feel a glimmer of hope. She hadn't dismissed him entirely. There was an acknowledgement, however faint, that something wasn't right between them. It was a sign that there might still be a chance. The rest of the dinner unfolded more lightly after that. They talked about trivial things, reminisced over old stories, and he even managed to make her laugh a few times, something he hadn't seen in months. As they left the restaurant, he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. In a subtle way, he had begun to chip away at the wall between them. Back in the car, as she gazed out the window, he allowed himself a small smile. It was just the first step, but he knew that little by little, he might be able to reignite what they had lost. This was only the beginning. The next day, as he replayed the moments from the previous evening in his mind, a sense of satisfaction washed over him. The dinner at the restaurant had been a modest success, not earth-shattering, but marked by small signs that something within her was beginning to stir. For a brief moment, it was as if the weight of routine had lifted, allowing her to glimpse a part of their past. It was a flicker of light in the darkness, and that was enough for him to keep going. But he knew the road ahead would still be long. One single evening wouldn't mend the years of emotional distance that had built between them. The key would be persistence, creating more moments like that one. Small gestures to reignite the memories and emotions they had lost. His next plan would be something simple but deeply meaningful. He remembered a time early in their marriage when they would take spontaneous walks in the park near their home. It was a habit they'd developed, often for no particular reason, simply for the joy of being in each other's company. The park had been a quiet refuge where they could talk, laugh, or simply walk side by side without rushing. He decided to take her back to that place. That evening, when she came home from work, he greeted her with a calm smile, careful not to sound too deliberate. "What do you think about a walk in the park?" he asked. She looked at him, clearly surprised by the suggestion. It wasn't something they'd done in years. In fact, she couldn't even recall the last time they had done anything like that together. "A walk in the park? Now?" she asked, her tone slightly skeptical. "Yes, I thought it might be nice. The weather's good, and, well, we don't have anything urgent to do. We could go out and walk for a bit like we used to." She hesitated for a moment. There was something in his tone that felt sincere, different from past attempts to fill the void with meaningless distractions. Perhaps it was the calmness he exuded, as if he wasn't expecting anything grand, just a shared moment. "All right, I think we can go," she finally said. The park was quieter than he remembered. Maybe it was the time of day, or maybe the years had changed the flow of people who used to visit. Either way, he felt content with the silence that enveloped them as they walked side by side. The green grass stretched out before them, and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze was almost comforting. For a while, they walked in silence, neither feeling the need to speak. It was a comfortable silence, different from the awkwardness they sometimes felt at home. He glanced at her occasionally, noticing how her steps were slower, almost thoughtful. Perhaps she, too, was remembering the days when they did this more often, when the silence between them was natural and not a symptom of disconnection. "Do you remember when we used to come here every weekend?" he asked, breaking the silence gently. She smiled, a small, distant smile. "I do. Those were good times," she said, her voice tinged with a melancholy he hadn't expected. "We used to do so many things together. What happened, do you think?" he asked, more to himself than expecting an answer. She stopped for a moment, looking at the trees around them. There was no anger in her expression, only a weariness he recognized. She didn't blame him, and he didn't blame her. Somehow, life had just pushed them down different paths, even as they walked side by side. "I think life just happened," she said finally. "Work, responsibilities, they all started piling up. And suddenly, we didn't even realize we'd stopped trying." He nodded. It was exactly how he felt, though he'd never put it into words before. "Maybe it's time to start trying again," he said, almost without thinking. She looked at him for a few moments, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. It wasn't something he often said, at least not like this. There was a note of hope in his words that she hadn't heard in a long time. "Trying again," she repeated, as though testing the idea. "But how?" He shrugged, not wanting to seem like he had all the answers. "One day at a time, I guess. Doing simple things like coming to the park. It doesn't have to be anything big. Just trying." She kept looking at him, this time with a more genuine, albeit faint, smile. It was an expression he hadn't seen in so long, and for a brief moment, he felt he had touched something within her, something that wasn't entirely lost. The walk continued in silence, but this time the silence felt lighter, less burdened with unspoken expectations. When they returned home, she seemed more at ease, as if a layer of exhaustion had been lifted from her shoulders. He felt he had, indeed, planted a small seed. That night, as they prepared for bed, she moved closer to him, subtly, but noticeably. It wasn't an overt gesture of affection, but it was enough for him to realize that something between them was shifting. There was an unspoken closeness, a step, however tentative, toward reclaiming what they had lost. And, for now, that was enough for him. He didn't need promises or guarantees. Just knowing that she was willing to try again was all he could hope for in that moment. It was a quiet progress, but it was real. The days that followed brought a strange sense of calm to him. There was something different in the air, as if he and his wife were slowly finding a new rhythm. While there were still silences between them, they no longer felt as oppressive. Now, it seemed as though both were, in their own way, allowing the distance between them to narrow, even if only slightly. For him, however, every moment carried a weight his wife couldn't understand. Every gesture, every smile, every fleeting connection was precious because he knew time wasn't on their side. And with that thought came memories of the past, some joyful, others painful. While he worked to recreate moments of happiness, he couldn't stop himself from being haunted by the mistakes they had made over the years. One morning, as he was tidying up the living room while she was out, he came across a photo album on a dusty shelf, long forgotten. Curious, he opened it, letting himself be transported back in time. The first photos were from their wedding, a time when they both seemed young, radiant, and full of dreams. In one photo, they were at the park they had recently visited. She smiled with an ease that made it seem like the future was a bright and certain promise. As he flipped through the pages, the images progressed through the years. There were pictures of trips they had taken, parties with friends, and eventually photos of their children as toddlers. He stopped at a photo of them with their children during a beach trip, one of the last times they had all seemed genuinely happy together. In that moment, he couldn't help but wonder when things had started to change. It was hard to pinpoint an exact moment. Life had indeed become a relentless cycle of commitments, responsibilities, and small emotional oversights. Work consumed much of his time, and at some point he began prioritizing his career over moments with his family. He remembered the late nights when he came home exhausted, barely able to hold a conversation with her. Arguments had emerged gradually, small fights over trivial matters that, over time, accumulated into an emotional burden. Suppressed memories began surfacing more strongly. He recalled one particular argument about a family trip he had canceled at the last minute because of a work meeting. She had been furious, accusing him of not caring about the family anymore. At the time, he had defended himself by saying that work was necessary to secure their future. But now, looking back, he realized how convenient that excuse had been. He wasn't securing a better future. He was neglecting the present. The pain of these memories hit him hard. It wasn't just the guilt over past mistakes, but the realization that with more time and fewer excuses, they might have saved themselves before reaching this point of distance. Now, he had so little time left, and that thought consumed him. As he flipped through the album's final pages, he noticed the photos became scarcer. The last few images were from formal events, graduations, birthdays, but they lacked the warmth and closeness of the earlier pictures. It was as if, somewhere along the way, they had stopped documenting real life, and that hurt more than any past argument. When his wife came home, she found him sitting on the couch with the album open in his lap. She watched him silently before sitting down beside him. She glanced at the photos, and for a moment, they stayed quiet, flipping through the pages together. "It feels like a lifetime ago," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It does," he agreed. He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I know I let a lot of things slip." The confession escaped before he could stop it. She kept looking at the album, but he noticed her hands trembled slightly. "It wasn't just you," she said after a pause. "I think we both let things slip away." Those words, so simple, held a profound truth. There wasn't just one person to blame. They had both allowed life to pull them apart, little by little. Yet, knowing that she also saw things this way gave him a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was still time to fix things. They closed the album together, and she rested her hand on his. The gesture was small but significant. There were years of hurt between them, but in that quiet afternoon, they both seemed willing to let those buried memories remain in the past where they belonged. It was a beginning. That night, after their shared moment with the photo album, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders, even if only for a moment. Her hand on his, the comfortable silence between them, and the way she had acknowledged their mutual faults gave him a hope he didn't know he still had. But there was something deeper he knew he needed to face. The truth about his health. He still hadn't told her about his terminal diagnosis. Even as he worked to recreate memories and restore their bond, the illness continued to eat away at his body. Each new gesture of affection, each attempt at reconciliation, was a small victory, but also a reminder that time was slipping away. He didn't know how much longer he had, and with every passing day, the urgency to reveal the truth grew within him. But he was afraid. It wasn't just the fear of death that had haunted him for months. His real fear was her reaction. He was terrified that, upon learning the truth, she would close herself off, that the reconciliation they were beginning to build would turn into a burden of premature mourning. He didn't want her to see him only as a dying man. He wanted her, in the time they had left, to see him as the man she had once loved, the man with whom she had built a life, no matter how imperfect it had been. As much as he tried to push those thoughts aside, he knew he couldn't keep them to himself much longer. And that truth came to light in an unexpected way. It was a sunny afternoon when he suggested a quick trip to the coast, the same place where, years ago, they had spent one of the most memorable holidays of their lives. His wife was surprised but agreed to the idea. The invitation seemed improbable for someone who, in recent years, had avoided any kind of spontaneity. But perhaps that was exactly what they needed, something out of the routine, a place to escape the worn-out reality of their daily lives. When they arrived at the beach, the sound of the crashing waves and the salty smell of the sea brought a wave of nostalgia. The sun was shining, and for a few moments, everything felt like it used to. They walked together along the sand, sharing laughter and stories they hadn't exchanged in a long time. He could feel the fresh breeze on his face, and for a brief moment, he forgot about the illness consuming him. But the body doesn't forgive time. As they walked back to the hotel, a sudden wave of pain shot through his chest. He tried to ignore it, maintaining his smile, but his steps faltered, and his breathing grew labored. His wife, immediately alert, turned to him. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. He tried to nod, as if everything was under control, but the world around him began to spin. His legs weakened, and he leaned against a nearby post, struggling to catch his breath. "You're not okay," she insisted, now panicked. "What's happening?" He could no longer hide it. With his heart racing and his vision starting to blur, he sank onto the nearest bench, trying to calm the pain radiating through his body. Her expression shifted from fear to confusion, as though she was trying to make sense of what she was seeing. "I need to tell you something," he said weakly. She knelt beside him, gripping his hand tightly. Her eyes were filled with worry but also a sudden understanding. "What's going on?" she asked again, her voice softer now, as though she feared the answer. He closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his courage. He had rehearsed this moment so many times in his mind, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of saying it aloud. When he opened his eyes again, he felt a mix of relief and pain. "I'm sick," he began, his voice trembling. "I have cancer. It's advanced. Terminal." The word hung in the air between them, heavy as a stone, crushing any semblance of normalcy that might have remained. He watched as her face transformed, her expression of confusion replaced by one of utter shock. "What do you mean?" She could barely speak. "You never told me anything. How long have you known?" "A few months," he admitted, the guilt weighing heavier now that the truth was out. "I didn't want to worry you. I wanted—" He hesitated, knowing the next words would be even harder. "I wanted to fix things between us before I told you." Her face twisted in a mixture of anger and pain. She stood, taking a step back as if she needed space to process what she had just heard. "So all these things you've been doing, the walks, the dinners, the trips, they were because you're dying?" Her voice was incredulous, as if she were trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't make sense. He nodded, his eyes fixed on hers, searching for some sign of understanding. But in that moment, all he saw was the shock and hurt he had dreaded she would feel. "I just wanted you to love me again," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. She was silent for a few seconds, the wind blowing around them, mingling with the distant sound of the waves. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "I've always loved you," she said quietly. "I was just trying to survive all of this." In that instant, they both understood that, no matter how little time they had left, the love they shared still existed in some form. The days following his revelation were filled with silence, but not the same heavy, distant silence that had once enveloped them. This was a different kind of silence, one laden with emotion, reflection, and, above all, pain. She didn't say much after that moment on the beach. Their drive home felt longer and more uncomfortable than the trip there, each of them lost in their own thoughts, trying to process what had happened. For him, there was relief. Relief in finally having told her the truth, in no longer carrying the burden of his condition alone. But there was also a profound sadness, as though he had robbed her of any chance for a fresh start without the shadow of death looming over them. He knew the weeks ahead would be difficult, that every gesture and every word would carry the weight of impending loss. She too was grappling with her emotions. The anger she initially felt at being kept in the dark began to fade, replaced by a deep sadness and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Yet, amidst the pain, there was something unspoken between them, a quiet resolve to make the most of the time they had left. He knew that moving forward would mean navigating a delicate balance, cherishing the moments they could still share while facing the reality of what lay ahead. She, on the other hand, was overwhelmed. She felt betrayed that he hadn't told her sooner, yet she also understood why he hadn't. He had tried to spare her the pain, but in doing so, he had created another barrier between them. Now, she knew there wasn't enough time to process everything, to resolve all the unanswered questions that had built up over the years. And that hurt her in a way she couldn't fully describe. The morning after their trip, he woke to find the bed beside him empty. She was already up, but this time something felt different. Her absence didn't feel as cold as it had before. Slowly, he got out of bed, the familiar pain a constant companion, and found her in the kitchen making coffee. Her face was serious, but there was no anger. When she looked at him as he entered, the silence between them felt heavy with unspoken words. "We need to talk," she said at last, placing a cup of coffee on the table. He felt a knot tighten in his throat but nodded. He had known this moment was coming. She needed answers. "I'm sorry for keeping this from you," he began, his voice low. "It wasn't fair." I just didn't know how to tell you. I wanted—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I wanted the time we had left to be different." She studied him, her eyes filled with deep sadness. She sat down at the table and he followed, sitting across from her. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting a soft glow over the kitchen, but it wasn't enough to lift the weight of their conversation. "I understand why you did it," she said, her voice controlled but trembling. "But you took away my right to deal with it. I would have wanted to be there for you, to help you." She paused, as if the words were struggling to come out. "You can't just protect me from everything." He nodded, feeling the guilt creep in again. "I know. It was selfish of me," he admitted. "But I was scared too. Scared that if I told you, things wouldn't change between us. That you wouldn't see me as I am anymore, but as someone who's already leaving." She stayed silent for a moment, absorbing his words. He was right. She did see him differently now, as someone fading away. But it didn't change the fact that she still loved him, and that confused her. She felt anger and love all at once, a conflict that suffocated her. "You're right," she said with a heavy sigh. "I do see you differently now, and that scares me." She lifted her gaze to meet his, her eyes glistening with tears she was trying to hold back. "But what scares me more is the time we've lost. All the fights, the silences. I don't know if we can get it all back." His chest tightened. That was his greatest fear too. There were no illusions that they could return to who they once were. The time they had lost was gone forever, but he hoped they could still do something with what little they had left. "I know we can't get back what we lost," he said softly, "but maybe we can find a way to make the time we have left matter." She quickly wiped her eyes, as if trying to keep her emotions in check. "And how do you imagine we'll do that?" she asked, her voice heavy with resigned sadness. "One day at a time," he said with a small shrug. "We can start now by being more honest with each other. And maybe little by little we can reconnect. Not like before, but in a new, truer way." She looked at him, tears still in her eyes, but her expression softened. There was a quiet acceptance there, an understanding that, even with everything that had happened, they still had a choice. They couldn't erase the past, but they could decide what to do with the present. "I'll try," she finally said, her voice low but firm. "I'll try to be here for you, every day, in the best way I can." He felt a wave of relief mixed with gratitude. There were no grand promises or guarantees, but it was more than he could have hoped for. They were willing to try, and at that moment, that was all that mattered. In the days that followed, they began to talk more, sometimes about the past, sometimes about trivial things. Small gestures of affection began to return, like the way she rested her hand on his at the table or the way he watched her closely, trying to savor every moment. It was a slow, difficult reconciliation, full of pain and hesitation, but it was also a sincere one. They still had a long road ahead of them, but for the first time in a long time, they were both willing to walk it together. As the weeks passed, he felt his body deteriorating more noticeably. The fatigue that had once been occasional became constant, and the pain grew more frequent and intense. Even so, he did everything he could to ensure it didn't overshadow the moments he was sharing with her. He knew his time was running out, but somehow, the urgency that had once consumed him now felt less important. What mattered now was the quality of the days they had left, not their quantity. Their days took on a simple rhythm, but in a way that brought peace. They stayed occupied with small routines. She prepared breakfast, and they talked about trivial things like the news or the weather. In the afternoons, he rested while she took care of the house, and in the evenings, they watched movies or read together, side by side on the couch. There was something comforting in these everyday moments, something he hadn't appreciated before when his mind was always distracted by work and responsibilities. Now, every gesture, every shared glance, felt significant. Their reconciliation wasn't marked by grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was built, little by little, through small but genuine acts. They still had difficult conversations at times, especially about what lay ahead, but somehow those conversations became less painful and more honest. The fear of loss was still there, but there was also a mutual understanding that, however short their remaining time, they were finally together. One late afternoon, as they sat on the porch, she looked at him with an expression both gentle and deeply meaningful. "Have you been thinking a lot about what's going to happen?" she asked carefully, her voice low and hesitant. He knew exactly what she meant. Death had been an invisible presence hovering over them all this time, rarely mentioned directly. He took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "Yes," he replied simply. "I think it's hard not to." She nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I just don't know if I'm ready," she confessed, her voice trembling. "To watch you go." He reached out and gently touched her hand. He knew there was no easy answer to that. How could anyone ever be ready to lose someone they loved? "No one ever is," he said sincerely. "But we're doing the best we can. And for me, that's enough." She squeezed his hand, a silent gesture of gratitude. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun slowly sink into the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and gold. The world around them continued to turn, but for them, time seemed to slow down. Despite the progression of his illness, he felt a sense of peace. The recent weeks had brought him something he hadn't expected to find: a serene acceptance, not just of the fact that his life was nearing its end, but also of what had happened between him and his wife. They had both made mistakes, allowed life to pull them apart, but somehow they had found their way back to each other. And for him, that was enough. As time passed, he began to depend on her more. His strength was fading, and there were days when he could barely get out of bed. She, in turn, became his caregiver, taking on a role he knew was painful for her, but which she fulfilled with quiet dedication. There were moments when he saw her struggling to hold back tears as she helped him walk or eat, but she never complained. He knew that every gesture, every act of care, was a profound expression of her love, and it touched him deeply. One night, as he lay in bed, feeling the growing pain that no medication could fully ease, she sat beside him, holding his hand. Her eyes were tired, but there was still a softness in them. "Are you afraid?" she asked, her voice a whisper in the stillness of the room. He thought for a moment before answering. Of course, he was afraid. The unknown always carried fear. But in that moment, the fear seemed overshadowed by something greater. "Not as much as I used to," he said with a faint smile. "I think what scared me the most was leaving without fixing things between us. But now I feel at peace." She squeezed his hand more tightly, and he saw tears streaming down her face. He wanted to say something to comfort her, to make her feel better, but instead, he simply stayed there, holding her hand, letting her feel what she needed to feel. He knew that sometimes silence was more powerful than any words. That night, as she fell asleep beside him, he stared at the ceiling, his body weary but his mind calm. He knew the end was near, but there were no more regrets. They had found their way back to each other, and no matter how painful what lay ahead might be, he knew he wasn't alone. And that was enough. The end came quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a gentle breeze on an autumn morning. He had spent the previous night in a deep sleep, his body too weak to endure the weight of the pain that had consumed him in recent days. His wife, by his side, watched his every breath with a heavy heart, sensing the moment was near but unable to shake the hope that maybe he still had one more day, one more hour. She had spent the last few weeks in a constant state of alertness, caring for him with a silent but exhausting dedication. She knew the end was inevitable, but no amount of preparation could make her ready for it. Every action she took, every touch, was filled with deep love but also an overwhelming fear. She had done everything she could to be there for him, but the feeling of helplessness was crushing. That morning, as the first light of dawn began to peek over the horizon, she noticed a change in his breathing. The slow, shallow rhythm that had become familiar now seemed even more labored, as though each breath was a monumental effort. She held his hand, more to connect with what little remained than to offer comfort, feeling his cold, pale skin while trying to convey some warmth. Tears began to stream down her face, silent as she watched his final moments. He was at peace. There was something almost serene about his expression, as though, even in his last moments, he was accepting what was to come. There was no visible pain on his face, only a calmness she couldn't fully understand but which somehow reassured her. As his breath slowed to a stop, she felt the enormity of the loss settle over her. But even in the depths of her grief, she clung to one undeniable truth. They had found their way back to each other. In those final weeks, they had shared something real, something pure, a love that, despite everything, had endured, and that, she knew, would remain with her forever. When he took his final breath, it was as if the wind itself had stilled. She felt the weight of his absence, a sudden void that engulfed her, and she knew he was gone. For several minutes, she sat there, holding his hand, her face wet with tears that now flowed freely. The room was enveloped in an absolute silence, broken only by the sound of her uneven breathing. She gazed at him for a while, his still body, the absence of breath, and felt a pain so deep it was almost physical. The man with whom she had shared so many years, so many moments, good and bad, was no longer there. The emptiness was devastating. Yet, at the same time, there was a sense of gratitude, an understanding that in these last months, they had managed to reconnect, to find their way back to each other despite everything. She stood slowly, unable to pull herself completely away but knowing she had to. There was a strange calm within her, as though she understood, in some profound way, that he was at peace, that he had departed without regrets. She picked up the letter he had found weeks earlier, the one she had written years ago but never given to him, and held it gently in her hands. Sitting at the kitchen table, the yellowed paper before her, she allowed herself to revisit the words she had written back then. Words that now seemed distant, yet still carried the same meaning. She smiled through her tears, remembering the love she had felt while writing each line. Taking a deep breath, she decided she needed to write another letter. She pulled out a blank sheet of paper, placing the old letter beside her, and began to write. This letter wasn't for him, it was for herself. She needed to put into words everything she had learned over the past few months, everything that time together, despite its pain, had meant to her. She wrote about the love they had rediscovered, about the quiet and gradual reconciliation that had grown between them. She wrote about the nights they spent side by side in silence and the moments when they exchanged words that had once felt impossible to say. She wrote about the pain of losing him but also the gratitude for having him by her side, even if the time they truly reconnected was far too short. When she finished, she felt drained but somehow lighter. Folding the letter carefully, she placed it alongside the old one. There was no need to read it again. She knew what those words meant, and that was enough. She stood and walked back to the bedroom. His body was there, but she felt that, in some way, he had already left, carried away by the serenity of his final night. She stayed by his side for a few more moments, in respectful silence, before stepping away. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew, somehow, she would survive the pain. Time wouldn't erase the loss, but healing would come, little by little. The love they had shared in his final days would remain etched in her memory. It was a goodbye but also a new beginning. In the end, he departed, but not before restoring something essential between them: the love that had been lost over the years. Even in the face of imminent death, the time they shared in his final days gave them a quiet yet profound reconciliation. She was left with the ache of loss, but also with the peace of knowing that until his last breath, he left this world in harmony, knowing they had reconnected in a meaningful way. Now, as she moves forward, her heart carries not only sadness but also gratitude for the final moments they lived together. The love, though tested by time, endured until the very end and will continue to live on in her memories, a soft flame that will never fade.